I, yeah, I ended up deciding to talk about this. This is something I'm a lot more passionate about. Well, I shouldn't say a lot more passionate about. I'm just really passionate. Had a lot of content on it already. And but I did want to say, if you're a member of the Forge Utah Foundation, or if you're not, you should join. It's a great little foundation. We have a lot of active members on there. It's small, but a lot for local, and some just brilliant people. So smart people in there to ask questions. There's job postings. It's a great place. And I do want to say, I mean, my original topic was on building a community, and with the rough couple of years we've had, I remember Joe Reese, who owns like a data consulting company. I was talking with him on the Forge Utah Slack, and he's like, this is the time to like make the community. And I kind of let you down, to be honest. Mariah and Annalisa and Tandy, have done great running this conference and carrying on the organization. But if COVID's been hard for you as an engineer, and you're not the kind of engineer that likes working at home all the time, like, I just want to say I'm sorry that we weren't there for you at Forge. It was such an opportunity to build that community, but better late than never. This is a great opportunity to build it. And so again, thank you to Mariah and Annalisa and Tandy for doing that.
Tandy's there.
Okay, am I good?
Yeah, you're all good, Clint. You're up.
What's that? Oh, Tandy's Derek. If you don't know who Tandy is, he worked at a company called Nozzle, and the founder's name was Derek, and so they had a competition and he had to rebrand his name as Tandy. So he's a great guy. Okay. Whoa. I gotta figure out where I gotta put this to not blast people's ears. So, practical tips on creating an engineering culture. Well, first I'll just introduce myself. I am one of the co-founders of the company that you're in. I'm not here anymore. I left in the beginning of the summer, and now starting a new software company with Jason Newman, who's in the back. And we just raised our pre-seed funding, which is super exciting. So we're excited to get off to the races, but I love Weave. I love coming back here. I have so many friends here. It's so great. And if you want to talk about boating, I'd love to talk about boating after, so let me know. Let's talk a little bit about culture. I want to start off with an anecdote or a story. I apologize to all the Weave employees that have known me for a long time. Just going to hear everything that you've already heard a million times, but that's okay. So this is Brian Chesky. He is one of the founders of AirBNB and is the current CEO. And AirBNB is passionate about culture. I want to read a story from his blog from 2014. He says, after we closed our Series C with Peter Thiel in 2012, we invited him to our office. This was late last year, and we were in the Berlin room showing him various metrics. Midway through the conversation, I asked him what was the single most important piece of advice he had for us. And he replied, don't F up your culture. This is a family-friendly conference, so I'm just gonna say F every time. There's a lot of F's in here. This wasn't what we were expecting from someone who just gave us $150 million. I asked him to elaborate on this, and he said one of the reasons he invested in us was our culture. But he had a somewhat cynical view that it was practically inevitable once a company gets to a certain size to F it up. How depressing, I thought. Were we destined to eventually F up our culture? We talked about it a bit more, and it became clear that it was possible to defend and actually build the culture. But it had to be done, it had to be one of the things we were most focused on. I thought to myself, how many company CEOs are focused on culture above all else? Is it the metric they measure closest? Is it what they spend most of their hours on each week? This is from his blog post in 2014. Then in 2019, as we all know what happened, a pandemic came. And for a company that's dependent entirely on travel, you can imagine what people were saying. And let me play a little sound clip from Brian Chesky. I don't think this hooks up to the sound, said Mariah, so I'll find my tab. Maybe. And I'll hold the mic to it. I hope this will work. Oh, but I also have
articles. The headlines of the press articles. The headlines of Airbnb last April involved, will Airbnb exist? Is this the end of Airbnb? These were headlines. I always felt like a crisis is an opportunity to do less than is expected of you, what is expected of you, or more than is expected of you. And the problem with most people managing crisis is they usually make one or two choices, to do less than expected or as much as expected. And those are almost always the wrong answers. Almost always, a crisis is a stage, is a spotlight. It's your moment to demonstrate your values. And it's easy to demonstrate your values in your culture in good times. Culture is what you do in the darkest of days.
The background music didn't help. Sorry. That's from Masters of Scale, who was in that podcast. So he's got all sorts of noises and music that he puts in. But hopefully you caught that. You know, he said the headlines were coming out like, "Is this the end of Airbnb?" Like they're going to tank. They're venture backed. They have all this. You know, they depended on all this money, and now it's all going to go away. Like they're going to disappear potentially. Like, it's a big deal for them, right? But I love what Brian Chesky said there. He said, if you live your cultures in the good time, your culture and your values in the good time, that's easy. Living your culture and values in the bad times, that's where it's hard. And he did it. And he's a master of culture. And they live their culture in everything that they do, which I think is so awesome. So let me get back to the deck here. And so I don't know if you guys are familiar with if it worked out, but it kind of did. And I'll show you how. Uh-oh. What do I get for using a SaaS slide builder? Okay, here we go. Well, it worked out. They did have to do a little bit of a layoff, which they were trying not to do, but they took great care of those employees, gave them like a year of health benefits and a good severance. But then they ended up, everything turned around, right? And they got a bunch of, they got some loans to carry them through the hard part. And then they IPO'd in the middle of the pandemic. And now they're worth $107 billion, I checked yesterday. Like, what the crap? And so I guess you could say like it's survivorship bias. You could totally say that. Everyone looks at these successful companies and they're like, it's correlation, it's not causation, right? But I guess what I could say to you is, yes, you can build a company on a mediocre culture, absolutely, and even build a successful company. But if you have a great culture, you will get outsized returns. And I think the data suggests that. And so is it survivorship bias? Here's just a couple of studies that came up from Googling this. Look, 495% of growth or returns instead of 170% in strong cultures. Companies with a strong culture saw a 4x increase in revenue growth versus others. Even if you just get named to the best places to work on Glassdoor, it gives you a stock bump, which I thought was hilarious, a 0.75% stock bump. Taking care of your employees works. Creating a better culture works. It makes your company better, and you will get better returns because you get the best people. So, culture is important. I couldn't talk about culture without giving a shout out to my co-founder here. I call him the founder. I'm a co-founder. He's the founder of Weave here, Brandon Rodman. He's the one that got me on this culture kick, and he spent an outsized amount of on culture at Weave. And I think that was one of the big reasons why Weave is successful, and they filed their S1 this week. I don't know if you guys saw, Weave is going to IPO here in the next couple months, which is so exciting. So thank you to Brandon. And I do want to point out that we didn't get it right all the time. It wasn't perfect at Weave. And we have lots of like discussions on the Weave alumni Slack about what did we do wrong, what could we have done better. You know, as we got past 500 employees, yeah, we were focused on culture, but we lost track of some of our operational concerns. So it's not about just culture. You kind of have to do all of the above. But we don't make the same mistakes twice. I was telling that to Jason today, and he's like, yeah, we're just going to make new ones. I was like, that's fair. We'll make new ones, but we won't make these mistakes. What else? I wanted to say, in talking about the importance of company culture, I know that not everyone here is going to start their own business. I know not everyone here is going to be a CEO. Not everyone is even going to be a manager. We had a hell of a time trying to hire managers at Weave, and I get it. Like, when you're a builder and you're an engineer and that endorphin rush when you're launching products, like, there's nothing like it. And having to go manage people sucks. And so I understand the I want to be a builder mentality. But some of you will be managers if you're not already. And this doesn't just apply to only CEOs or CTOs. This can apply to the individual contributor as well. Because every person in a company helps control the culture of that company, right? And that's why I put that water droplet at the beginning of the presentation, is like one person can have this massive ripple effect on everything around them. And that can be you. So keep that in mind, even though some of the presentation kind of highlights leadership and engineering leadership or executive leadership, think about how it can apply to the individual contributor as well. So I've illustrated why I think culture is important. Now I'm going to get to that part of where the practical. And stay with me here. I know we're at the end. I'm not going the full 45 minutes, so you can make it. I'm going to talk to you about some actual things that we did at Weave to help build the culture. So these are the 3 steps that I would suggest to having a successful engineering culture. First, you have to define it. Second, you have to measure it. And then the third is you have to live your culture, even in the hard times. Okay? And I'll go over each of these in a little bit more detail on what we did practically at Weave. So the first one of defining your culture, you have to define your values. That's what it comes down to on defining your culture. The first thing you have to do is find out, what do you value as an engineering team? What's important to you? Is it super skills? Is it, what is it that's so important to us? What are we looking for when we hire people? What are we looking for when we promote people? And when we were scaling engineering team, I went and tried to find all the values that I could find at other companies, and I settled on SendGrids, and I loved SendGrids. They really resonated with me. And these were our engineering values for a year and a half, almost 2 years, before Weave as a company got their own cultural values, and then we started using those. But in our engineering team, we had cultural values first, which I love that. We kind of led in a lot of ways at Weave. And so SendGrid's 4 H's were honest, hungry, humble, and happy, which I loved. And when you're trying to define your values, you can try and do alliteration or whatever, get them all the same letter. That makes it more catchy. Definitely don't do more than 5. You want it to be memorable. But even if they don't start with the same letter, I'm sure you can come up with something cool and catchy. But that's the first thing you got to do, is just find out what you value, even if it's just on your team, okay? I wanted to highlight the humble one because I think this is really important in engineering culture. I love this quote from the book Software Engineering at Google. You simply can't make a good software team with a few rock star engineers who play by their own rules. That may work in the short term, but in the long term, it will fail. You need to allow people to continually evolve and contribute to the organization, and they need to be part of a team. If you're in an organization with more than 3 engineers, you're going to have a team. And the team as a whole is what determines your success. If you have one person that's awesome, but sucks to work with, that team is not going to perform at its best. It just will not. And so I would encourage all of you, if you're defining your engineering cultures, come up with something around humility in some way. So think about that. After you define your values, the next step, which I think is really cool, I got this from Kevin Scott. He's the former VP of engineering at LinkedIn. He's a big culture believer as well. He came up with this idea, maybe he didn't come up with it, but he has this great blog post on First Review about creating a cultural manifesto for engineering, which I love. And we tried to do it at Weave. It was always a work in progress. I think in our engineering manual, I had a lot of these things, these topics that he had outlined in there with blank, nothing. I was like, we'll fill those in eventually. And 3 years went by or whatever, and I think one other person outside of me added something. That's okay. We were trying. It was always a work in progress. But you can see over here on the right, culture and values is like the second one in. But in engineering, you have a lot of things that kind of define your operational culture that you need to define. And so as you're scaling, these are things that you need to come up with an answer. And he gives some great tips on coming up with this. And the tips that he gives, the advice that he gives is he gives four pieces of advice. First, don't wait for disaster to happen. He talks about examples in the blog post where if you wait too long to define your culture, disaster can happen. Like you will lose team members. I went to a great conference where Twilio spoke very candidly about their engineering team, and they got to a point where they were firefighting. The culture got terrible. They were working way too many hours, and they lost 30% of their engineers in the Bay Area in 6 months. 30%! Like imagine the mind share that left the building and how much that cost that company. And that was like the wake-up call for them, and they were like, we're switching the culture. We're not doing this anymore. I love it. But don't wait for that to happen, okay? If you're scaling and growing your engineering team, if you're a leader, you need to be thinking about this. Debate it and amend it frequently. This is not a static document, right? When you define your culture, it can change, and that's okay. This one gets big as you get bigger. You're going to come up with things in your culture manifesto in engineering, especially when you're making decisions about how you do things that are people won't agree with at your company. It will piss off the SREs, it'll piss off the developer experience team because you picked the wrong tool. But it's not about consensus. You can't make everyone happy. It's really about putting it on paper and saying, we agree to this as an engineering team. It's a commitment. And then this last one, which I really love, and I think this can apply to all of you. How does your engineering team, what is your purpose within the context of the company that you're in? He gives a couple of examples that I want to highlight here. He came from a company called AdMob. Let's see. Oh, and at AdMob, they kind of had some first mover advantage on their technology. And so he said, we needed the engineering team to allow us to take every possible first mover advantage. That was the characteristic that was going to define their culture at AdMob. And then he said when he went to LinkedIn, it was different. He said, instead, we asked ourselves, how can we leverage a huge set of high quality data to build a suite of products for power users of LinkedIn? And that implied a completely different set of technology and operational perspectives. So figure out the role of engineering is in your company, not just to make engineering win, but to make your company win. Like, what is the role? And then the last thing that I'll mention about defining your culture, this is my favorite one to talk about recently because I've been talking to others about it. And this applies to the individual contributor as well as leaders, is if you've heard of manager readmes. And it doesn't have to be just managers. It can be just your readme. It's a personal readme, your working readme. Google it, look for engineering manager readmes, and you'll get a lot of blog posts where you get the famous ones that are really, really good. And what it does is it allows you to like write down your personal values, how you work, how people can work with you best. Maybe you have weird tics, like don't talk about politics in front of me because I will get angry. That probably should be in my readme. Or if I'm yelling, it's not because I'm mad, it's because I'm excited or I have the strong opinion. I'm working on that too. There's a lot of things you can put, but the whole goal is to just accelerate how well other people can work with you faster. And I've been flirting with the idea of when we start hiring people, we're going to make this required for everyone that comes into my new company, is you have to write your own README. And then when we hire new employees, you can just read the READMEs of everyone you're going to work with, and you have an idea of what you're dealing with, which is really cool. So that's the last thing I'll say about defining your culture. The next one I want to talk about is how do you measure it, right? How do you know you're doing a good job on your culture? Because if you don't know if you're doing a good job, you can't improve. And so I have 4 different methods of measuring culture that I want to talk to you about. I'm not going to go into super detail. We're at the end of the day. We're tired. But you can look. I'll share these slides out with everybody later, and you can look these up, okay? The first one is the Employee Net Promoter Score. If you're not familiar with NPS, it's one question survey. It says, would you recommend your friend, in this case, to work at your company? Super simple. It gives you a pulse. Excuse me. It gives you a pulse. If you only ask that one question, you don't necessarily get a lot of good feedback on what to improve, but it definitely gives you an idea of how you're doing, okay? So that's the first one. We did that at Weave. It was great. We did that as a whole company, actually, to see how we were doing. and it was a good pulse checker. The second one, which I think applies to engineering teams specifically, which I love, and a lot of you have probably done this, Spotify Team Health Check. We did this once a quarter at Weave, and it just has a bunch of topics, and everyone... Gosh, I'm getting dry. Oh, look at this. 1 second.
Branded.
It's even branded Weave water. It's Weave water. This one, you kind of do the survey live, this team health check, and you ask questions about these topics, and everyone on the team, like a small team, I mean like the team of 8 that you're in or whatever, 5 to 8, goes of thumbs up, thumbs sideways, or thumbs down, and you aggregate the results across all your teams. In Spotify, they call them squads, and then you have an idea of where your teams are at and how they're doing. This is a great one. Definitely look it up if you haven't done it. And then we get into some more advanced ways of measuring culture. If you're familiar with the Google study that they did on effective teams, it was like a 3-year-long study. What made their best teams most effective? And it turned out the most important feature of a productive team or their best teams was psychological safety. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty on that, but it's basically safety to communicate when things are wrong, and you can or give criticism and not feel like you're going to get shot. No shooting the messenger. And so it's about how, and it made this Western culture model framework because that's what it's based on. It made it famous. And so the generative is the one you want to be at. There are lots of different questionnaires that you can use to measure this. You send out a questionnaire to your employees, and it comes back, and you have like a percentage score on how you're doing from a psychological safety standpoint. It's a good one. The last one is the most complex. It is my favorite for some reason. I guess, well, let me give you a little bit of info on how it works. So this is the competing values framework. It's another cultural model that's out there. You can Google competing values framework. And it has 4 different types of cultures that are all competing against each other. And you try to weight that. You send the survey out to your employees, and you say, where's the culture at now, and where is it go, and where do you want it to be? Okay, and it makes this radar chart. They have to weight each one specifically in the question, so it takes a little bit longer. It takes about 30 minutes sometimes to fill it out if you think about it too much. Don't overthink it, but it allows you to get this radar chart, which I love, of the 4 different types of cultures, and also allows you as an engineering leader to say, what kind of culture do I want to have? And you can design it. Apparently I don't talk very much anymore. You can design it how your preferred culture, how you want it to be, and try to hire the people that are aligned to that culture, which is really exciting. But I love how it says, hey, look, you can't do all these things equally, or you can't do all these things all compete against each other. If you want to release things right now, do things now, you're going to sacrifice on doing things right in some aspect, or you're going to not collaborate as much as you should, right? Those are all things that are competing against each other. And when you have that, when you understand how they're competing, it makes you be very deliberate on how you're going to set up your culture, and then you can measure it this way, which is awesome. Okay. Give me 1 second to catch up. Okay. So that's it. There's four ways that practical ways of measuring your culture. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about, which is just really quick, is living your culture. Okay. Anyone seen this before? If you've read a culture book, whose culture is that? What'd you say? Anyone know?
Thunderbird.
Are there any old people in here that remember the company Enron? Yeah, that was up on their wall when you walked in. Integrity was first. It blows my mind. Like, that's crazy. That's like one of those things where like they sat around, they thought would make a good culture, and then they put it up on the wall, and no one ever talked about it again because there's no way they were living that culture. There's no way. And so, oh yeah, there's the logo. It's Enron. Crazy town. If you do not live the culture that you espouse, it will mean nothing. In fact, it'll be worse because you'll hire new people. They'll come in expecting one thing, and when they see that you don't live it, it kind of just takes away the integrity of the whole organization. And so if you're going to commit to this road of defining the values that you think are important, be prepared to live them. And I love what Brian Chesky says here. It's 1,000 things, 1,000 times. When you hire, when you write an email, when you're working on a project, when you're walking in the hall, when you're promoting, when you're interviewing, when you're doing one-on-ones, you have to live the culture. And you don't have to be perfect, but you have to be trying. And I think at Weave, we tried. And we clearly stated that we were trying. And that when we stated that we were trying and people saw it, they even gave us leeway when we messed up. And we just own the mess ups, right? And so that's the last thing that I want to leave you with. Live that culture. Thank you. That's it.